The NHL is terrified of the Minnesota Wild for this, as Bill Guerin is just proving once again why the Minnesota Wild have arguably the best future in the entire NHL, as they have been ranked number 2 on the Athletics' recent list of top prospect pools in the NHL for multiple reasons. A few guys that'll be making an impact in the NHL very soon, and a few that are already making an incredible impact. We got to dive into all that coming up on this episode of Hat Trick HQ. But before we get into the video, a quick reminder: 89% of you watching all these videos are not subscribed. We have daily NHL content on all the latest news, rumors, reports, stories around the league. So if that sounds good to you, hit the free subscribe button down below. Mark, let's get into this. And the big thing today is the article from The Athletic. They've been going day by day, all the best prospect pools in the NHL. And Minnesota, they jumped a lot this year. They ran all the way from 11th place all the way up to second place this year, and for good reason. They have a ton of incredible good prospects, and which better one to start with than Zeev Buium? The NHL's scared of this because not only do they have the cap space coming up in the future that I know we'll get into, but their prospects right now are already amazing. Feel free to pause, take a read through this. Not going to highlight too much of it, but Zeev Buium, his production mark has been undeniable. He looked amazing at the World Juniors. His points this year: 30 points in 25 games, 50 points in 42 games last year. He's on pace to put up similar numbers. I mean, starting with him, right now, he and some other guys we'll get into in a bit, along with a guy like Brock Faber and even Jonas Brodin, who are on the team now, are a big reason why this D-core, and we're not even into the forwards yet, could be one of the NHL's scariest in just a couple of years' time.
I mean, looking at Zeev too, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's the first time we're going to see an NCAA where a player puts up back-to-back 50-point seasons as a defenseman. He hasn't reached yet, but he is on pace to do this. Zeev is going to transition straight into this Minnesota lineup once he makes a jump into the NHL perfectly, as being the perfect partner in my eyes to someone like Brock. With Faber, you're looking at your right-handed defenseman of the future, and I do think Zeev is going to come in and immediately be that left-handed guy that they've not really been looking for at the moment, but one that's going to step in and maybe shock a lot of not only Wild fan, but the NHL with how explosive he is on the offensive end. I don't know how you feel about that, but I do see him going in as the number 2 defenseman and top lefty.
I mean, look, it's always hard to say because defensemen can develop at very different paces, but there's a history of players producing in college, and like especially with the style of game that he has, coming into the NHL right away and at least making an impact. I'd be surprised if he wasn't impactful right away. Whether he'll be number 2 right out the gate, I don't know. But again, in recent years, we've seen a lot of NCAA defensemen come to the NHL and basically show like, hey, if we are truly dominant in the NCAA, we will be impactful in the NHL right away. And again, the play style fits alongside Brock Faber very well. So that's one of the defensive pairings. But this is just one of the guys we got to get into because the forwards are also great. And down the middle is where, Minnesota fans are like, dang, what about the centers of the future? Well, one guy here now, Yurov's able to play the wing, but I think he could project as a center along with Stramel, who I think we'll talk about in a bit as well. But Yurov is also one of those guys. He put up historic numbers in his D+1 year back, or well, I guess it was what, D+2 year with a Metallurg, putting up 49 points in 62 games last year as a 20-year-old, 24 points in 44 games this year. The production's dropped just a little bit, as you can see. But again, he's projected to come in and be middle 6 right away, if not make an argument for top 6, right? And looking at the forward core now, I see a world where Yurov is coming in and maybe even playing on that second line, replacing a Johansson type guy. So not only do you have a guy that looks to be a top pairing defenseman in just a couple of years, you have one of the best international prospects in the NHL in Yurov who could come in and make an impact in scoring right away.
Yeah, no, looking at Europe too, I do think this guy, and I know with Zeev I was talking about him jumping in right into the top line, but I genuinely do think Yurov has the potential to be at the worst a middle 6 winger or center for the Minnesota as early as next season. I mean, looking at this, there are a couple guys getting up in age. You have Johansson, Zuccarello. These guys are not getting younger. But the biggest thing with this Wild team, and just going back to the article, having the second ranked prospect pool, this is one of the top teams in the NHL right now. They've been dealing with injuries. Right now, that lineup does not have Kaprizov in it, and a few other names with Hartman being suspended. But looking at this is a competitive team with the second ranked prospect pool. You see number 1 being the San Jose Sharks, that are the worst team in the NHL right now. But with the Wild being a team that was the best team in the NHL at one point, one of the best teams in the West before the Jets really took over, seeing them have this depth of just wingers, centers, sprinters, defensemen ready to make the jump. This is just insane. This is wild, I should say, on how good this team's going to be in the future. But Josh, looking at Yurov, do you think maybe as early as next season we see him maybe joining a line with Kaprizov, which might be pushing it because we do see how productive Rossi has been, but do you think he joins this middle six right away?
I mean, middle six for sure. I think we will see him with Kaprizov eventually. I mean, eventually meaning maybe next year, maybe a couple of years from now. There's a lot of options, but I think you're bang on to something here. Like, it's scary for the rest of the NHL. Like you said, San Jose is the #1 prospect pool. Montreal's the #3. Now, while Montreal has made a bit of a push this year, they've fallen off a cliff recently with a big time losing stretch. So Minnesota is like one of those teams that's still in the mix, and all the teams around them are struggling. And Minnesota still has a bunch of these guys. This isn't even counting the young guys in the NHL for these teams already, which is the craziest thing as well. So absolutely. And to move even on, there's a guy that has played a couple games this year for Minnesota, a guy who's played a bit more in the NHL, and that's David Jiricek, right? This is another trade that look, I don't think we forget, but I think other NHL fans sometimes start to forget that Minnesota even made, because again, he's only played 6 games for the Wild, scoring 1 goal, 1 assist in those 6 games. But man, the production that he's had when he's been with Minnesota has looked pretty good. Not just on the score sheet. I mean, like, it's okay on the score sheet, but he's looked smooth. Yeah, he still makes some mistakes, but he's one of those guys that projects to be another like second pairing defenseman. And David Jiricek has incredible offensive upside. So with him, Mark, I mean, I don't know where you project him, but to me, I think he can actually turn into, like, obviously when he was drafted 4th overall, like, they saw him as being, or 6th overall, sorry. I think it was 6. Yeah. I can barely see that. They're small. But still, when they drafted him, he was projected to be like a future top pairing right-hand defenseman. And there's a reason he was drafted that high. And in Minnesota, there's no pressure to fill in those shoes. To be a second pairing guy behind Faber while being an offensive specialist, this is a perfect situation for him as well.
Yeah, I mean, look at him. The biggest thing is we've seen Jiricek this year. The biggest problem with Jiricek before the trade was people said he couldn't skate. But seeing him with Minnesota, it seems like he's taken, and no jokes, no joke at this, the stride looks so much better with this guy. But the biggest problem with Jiricek is looking at the right side. Yes, Bogosian is getting up on age. You do have him on a 2-year deal. Spurgeon's there, Faber's there. I wonder where he fits in and what the timeline getting him up as a full-time player. I mean, we've seen him play with the Wild this year. I didn't think he looked at a place. His advanced numbers playing limited minutes were outstanding. But looking, Josh, do you think maybe they move on from a guy like Bogosian to get him up into the lineup? Or do you think it's not going to be a forced thing where he finally makes a breakout, where they look at him and say, hey, we can't keep you in the AHL anymore? Then they'll call him out.
They'll have flexibility next year. I don't think there's any rush to get him up to the NHL. They're going to do what makes the most sense. And if Jiricek hasn't proven that he's ready to make that jump, they're not going to force him to make that jump. But again, that financial flexibility that's not there this year. Like, he could have stayed up with the team if they weren't pressed right up against the cap when he was sent back down to Iowa, right? So, like, there's a world where he gets a real good opportunity as early as next year. But again, they're not going to force it. They don't need to. They have the time to develop these guys. And speaking of these guys, speaking of developing, there's one last guy I want to talk about before we look at their future, and that's Charlie Stramel. Just have to bring him up because he's kind of slept on too because of his really, well, less than stellar D+1 at the University of Wisconsin. He has 24 points in 29 games this year. He's been really good for Michigan State since transferring. He has really looked good. This development's been incredible. And again, a 6'3" forward who looks to be able to play center probably at the next level. He has the size to do it. He has the smarts to do it. I just wanted some quick comments from you on him because I love to see these kind of bounce back stories. These guys that some fans seem to give up on, especially these bigger guys that take longer to develop. Even a guy like him projecting as a depth, maybe bottom 6 center, a big guy who has that scoring upside for Minnesota. Even a guy like this right now with the cap going up over the next few years, they're going to be able to not only bring in good talent, but they're going to be able to sign their own guys as well and hopefully give guys like Stramel the opportunity to prove their worth.
I mean, looking at Stramel, I think he's going to come in and fill out this bottom 6 at some point perfectly. I mean, guys like Moose Foligno, he's been great on the bottom 6. Filling him out with another big body, a young guy that can fill out the system, maybe even a 4th liner on a cheap ELC is exactly what teams strive to do when they want to win a Stanley Cup. If you have an entire lineup of guys making $4 million, you're not going to fit under the cap. Teams that compete always have guys that overproduce on what they're being paid, and I think Stramel could come in and be that piece for the Wild in the bottom 6. I will touch on this very quickly. I do want to say Wallstedt is going to come in with Maff retiring next year. I'm not going to touch on him too much. I think he was ranked 4th or 5th, but once again, another piece to the Wild's just prospect pool. Looking at this, Josh, I'll throw you one last question on this. Looking at the prospects they have, the draft picks they have, everything like that, do you think the Wild might be like, hey, we're ranked #2, maybe we can move on a couple of these guys to add a piece for the deadline push?
Well, I mean, this deadline I think is possible. I mean, another guy we also forgot to kind of mention who's currently playing second line is Liam Öhgren. Like he's looked really good this year. That's the thing. There's so many of these guys. I think they are in a position where they could do that. But I mean, again, like moving on to these guys, they need to make the money work because of their salary cap being really, really tight. But looking at the next couple of years, this is the kind of team like, you're not going to be able to pay everyone, but especially if they lock up Boldy, Rossi, whatever Kaprizov's contract's going to be, there's still going to be some room to maybe bring in some other big names or move out some of your young guys and maybe some picks for another big name as well. There's a lot of options for the Wild. So the prospects not only could help them in the future with their play, could help them in a trade. The cap is opening up right at the right time. They're a very scary team. Let us know your thoughts down below on the Wild on all this stuff. But that'll do it for this episode of Hat Trick HQ. If you enjoy, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We have a lot more videos just like this coming up very soon. I'm Josh Gosse, my co-host, Mark Pye. We'll catch you in the next one.